Hey, good morning. I'm Dr. Chase Cunningham. I'm here presenting at CalicoCon with my good friends Matthew and Lee. We're going to run through some data that I pulled together on a recent survey to give Matt and Lee a little bit of freedom of conversation here. They didn't see a whole lot of this data before I actually drug them into this thing. I let them kind of look at it and peruse it, but I didn't want to give them weeks of chewing through the information to have really, canned responses. So this is as real and honest as you're going to get. And Matt and Lee, if you wouldn't mind, give a quick kind of intro on who you are, and then we'll go forward from that. So Matt, you please.
Matthew Rosenquist, been in cybersecurity 34 years, CISO, cybersecurity strategist, 24 of those at Intel.
And I'm Lee Seidman. I'm the founding partner of IT Health Partners, which is a healthcare-specific managed service provider.
Super. So we got a lot of experience here, and I want to point out one thing real quickly is none of us are container experts. I'm not a container expert. Matt, I don't think you would say that you're a container expert. I'm not an application expert either, but I wanted to do this survey because I think that there's been so much movement going on around zero trust and security and these types of things. I saw this, in my opinion, as kind of a critical flaw in where we're going because there's so much going on in containers and in applications and the way that we do dev that I thought it was good to get some data. So I sent this out to the people in my newsletter. It was a pretty targeted survey. The good thing is I didn't get 10,000 responses. I got almost 70, but those 70 people, which I think is enough to say we have consensus, are people that are actually doing the work. They're developers, they're CISOs, they're security operations personnel. So this is, I think, kind of ground truth data. So let's start diving into this. And the first question I got into after, like I said, I got about 60 something responses. The first question I really got into was, I, the respondent, understand the risks that containers present to my organization. And what you kind of see here is, to me, this is a bit of a shotgun response. I think there's some folks that would say they do, but there's also enough that don't flat out agree that they do, that this indicates to me that there is an exceptional level of risk with these types of containers and the applications that are being built on top of them. That's just my 2 cents. What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, we don't know what we don't know. So when I look at the strongly agree, I always have that in the back of my head. And especially with the agree or disagree, they just don't know. When I look at the disagree or strongly disagree, again, they probably realize there's this huge void out there. I'm looking at a little bit, but I'm probably missing a lot.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it I put kind of the agree category into the same as neither disagree and strongly agree, because for that very same reason. As I looked into the Kubernetes stuff even further when we knew we were doing this, there were things as I was researching it that took me to points where, I didn't even realize that piece I should look into, since this is such a vast, confusing area itself. So the ones I would believe more in here probably strongly agree, but I put the rest of them in the same category of there's things we don't know, but maybe we have an idea that we know what we're doing, but not entirely.
Yeah, and I think too, when you're dealing with the scale that containers present and the dynamic nature of that space, anytime that you have an admission of I don't know, it means that there's an I don't know to the factor of 10x, right? I mean, it's one thing to have I don't know when it's a bounded problem. It's another thing to say I'm not sure or I don't know when it is potentially exceptionally large in scale. And that is what containers and these types of cloud-enabled operations really present, in my opinion. It's not the problem of an unknown, like Matt was saying, an unknown for one. It's an unknown for 10,000, and those 10,000 things come up and go down and move, and it's just it's whack-a-mole on a scale that is even more miserable than the regular whack-a-mole.
And I think if we ask the pure experts in this field, I don't think any of them would come back and go, I strongly agree, I know all the risks. I think they would go, yeah, okay, I agree as the expert, the security expert, but I can't say I strongly agree. It's one of those things, the more you scratch at, the more you realize, there's another risk here I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, and we're running, I think I was looking at a study that was recently published by Akamai. all applications essentially touch containers now in some way, shape, or form. So that's a bit of an issue. Now, this was interesting for me because I was getting responses from people that were doing the work, and securing containers should be focused on. I was actually thinking that folks were going to say what the containers were doing was the most directly applicable thing. But what they actually came back and said with the largest majority is keeping the container from allowing an infection to spread was more critical in their opinion than these other ones. Now, there was a couple of folks that said that they're secure by default, which we know is not going to work on anything. But the issue here is it's not whether or not there will be a potential compromise. It's whether or not that compromise is being used to cause other spread infections within systems.
Yeah, well, I think also a lot of the documentation talks about hardening the nodes and the pods and things of that nature. And being a sysadmin myself, historically, the idea is making the things work and then hardening does not mean it's being synonymous with impervious. And that's where I think that this is an area where the concern is. Yeah, they know they can provide restrictions, they can do the role-based access controls and things of that nature, but there's still no way in their minds, respondents, of preventing this particular problem from any happening anytime.
Well, and this is a key thing that we talk about in the realm of ZT is accepting compromise. Like, you're going to have compromise. It's not a question of if, it's when and how bad, but really it's how much spread and can you manage that spread. And when you're dealing with containers and automation, that spread can be what basically bankrupts you if you do it wrong.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned with the last one. I'd like to see a little more emphasis. And I know you can't be perfect, but a lot of prevention, especially with those containers. If you've got a weak container and you're reusing it again and again and again, you're propagating those vulnerabilities every time you're creating that instance, that container. So, we've got to predict what's going to happen. We have to spend a lot of time preventing as much as we can. And then on the flip side, knowing that we're not going to be able to prevent everything, we want to be able to rapidly detect and be able to respond, contain the issue. So I think, all of these are important, but, it's not a perfect question set. It isn't. I'd like to see people be able to select a couple of things. Where your primary emphasis versus your lesser emphasis, and knowing where the prevention and prediction aspects, and that really should be weighted more, and then still having some effort towards the detection and the response capabilities. Because when things go sideways, you want that as well. So I would almost prefer, what are your percentages that you're allocating effort to, and seeing where that weighting falls.
That's a good call. I think you may have just crafted a question for my next survey. So
I think also here, question one about what the containers are doing, and the third one about keeping a container from allowing an infection to spread. I think there's a relationship there, because if you're using a development container and then you move it to production has different security rules than development for the most part. So if they don't know what the container is doing, they may not know how to do number three.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? I mean, those everything within these connected automated systems are, I guess, symbiotic, right? Everything affects something else. So if you don't know what it's doing, then you probably won't know whether or not it's infected or spreading infection, that type of thing as well.
As well as the second one, right? How do you limit the controls if you don't know what it's doing and what it needs to control? What is essential versus what is, not essential, and you should be carving that out.
Yeah, I guess this goes back to the kind of the OODA loop methodology, observe, orient, detect, and act, those types of things. So more good potential research to come on the heels of those. I didn't even know what this was, but this was a really interesting question when I started talking to developers. So container sourcing, the registry value that indicates the code origin for the containers, is important for security. Like I said, I'm not a container expert. I was talking to a bunch of developers when I kicked this survey off, and most of them said, well, we consider where we get the container from to be part of that sort of risk profile. It's good, in my opinion, that folks pretty much agreed that that's important. However, there still was a percentage that were like, I don't even have an idea what that is, which I would put myself into that particular category until I did the research. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, like all things, right? You want to know that the source of what you're downloading is trustworthy. If you're going to download an application off of a .ru domain, you're probably asking for trouble. Whereas if you're pulling it from that vendor's domain, you're probably looking at a better situation. And
So
because
getting
these
your containers
containers are
from a
reused
torrent,
again and
yeah.
again and again, you better trust that source. Because if I'm a bad guy, that's what I'm attacking. I don't care about your individual container. If I can corrupt the source and Trojanize that or get access to that, then everybody that calls it, I own them.
And it's
So,
it's almost like a SolarWinds software supply chain thing.
Yes, it is, because that's one of the beauties of Kubernetes, right? Of containers, is you're using your resources optimally. You're keeping that foundation the same and just reusing it, right? But if you can corrupt it, now you've corrupted the foundation.
Corruption.
You want everything.
Yeah. Right, which the importance on the configuration, which is the big, I'll call it the criticism of Kubernetes, is it's such a ever-changing, developing creation that what you might know how it worked to begin with may not apply on the next versions of it that are coming out. And it's so easy to misconfigure this thing that you may have that backdoor that you never realized you had.
Yeah, and those developers that I was talking to, for them, they said really where they want to get those container sourcing from is their goal is to get that as close to origin as possible, which, like you're saying, Matt, if you can get something inserted into that origin version, then from there on out, everything is poisoned, because that's what the developers want. So it's a good avenue of compromise to go as early and as low as possible into that registry thing as you possibly could.
Yeah, just like Citrix used to have their gold images when they did their piece. Same type of world.
We don't want to bring Citrix in here because, man, that's a fight anybody could have.
Sorry.
So this one was interesting too. Communication between containerized workloads is inherently secure. I think the majority of folks, no, but it was interesting too to say that roughly a third of the people that responded said either yes or they were unsure. Again, back to that, first premise, unsure, in my opinion, is risk. That means basically you're allowing that. And then the other piece is the applications that are, the way these things are talking to each other across pods within infrastructure, whatever else. I was kind of taking it as a non-developer person that there was kind of built-in security protocols within that. That's not the way that it works. It's actually optional, which is concerning.
Well, anytime I see the words inherently secure, the hair on the back of my neck stands up. So any security professional worth their salt, they see that, the answer is no. Just by default, it's no.
Right.
Yeah. But developers, for them, a lot of them are like, well, I don't know. And then the thing is, well, it's already in prod. So, it is what it is.
We released it yesterday. So
yeah, if you want me to pull that thing down, it's a whole other issue. And it's also kind of one of these things when you're talking to people about like satellites and how communication works. You have to wrap your head around it. Satellite communications between satellites, nobody ever thought about intercepting comms in something in space, so they never bothered to encrypt all that stuff. Whereas this is the same way. We're dealing with millions of little satellites communicating between each other, and no one really thought about, well, what goes on between those pods, between those individuals' containers, and that's a real risk. There's a lot of intel and a lot of good information you can gather if you put yourself in the right place.
Yeah, and I think this question is kind of leading back to what Matt was saying as a Dr. Zero Trust thing. I would naturally look at this now in 2022 with the word inherently secure. My answer to that question is most likely definitely not. But as to being able to explain why it's not is a different story.
Well, but there's also a piece here too. I think that's worth noting of a disconnect between the developer folks and the security people, right? Because those of us in the security realm with our tinfoil hats, like Matt's saying, we see inherent and we go, no, Whereas the developer people, as far as they're concerned, it's something to do and they ship code. So that's a problem as well, kind of on the organizational side.
Well, I think also, structurally, going back, probably Matt and I are probably similar age demographic of, 20, 30 years. It was, as an admin, you put a system together to provide functionality. And then came later on the people doing some very funky things. And you're like, all right, we have to use antivirus, that'll be protected. And then came hardening of the operating systems and how things functioned. After that point is when the developers started getting into securing their codes and the APIs and how things actually worked, versus using plain text or hard coding credentials and things of that nature. So I still think that side of the world is catching up to what the admin side's been doing for longer.
And, I look at this as well. The other thing I see here is we have the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the people are probably going, I'm going to go out and I'm going to try and secure this. Awesome. But there's 20% that aren't, and they're going to be the ones that cause most of the problems. And if you're a security person or an auditor and you do a spot check and you go, oh, I checked 2 or 3 and they seem to be secure, you need to have in the back of your mind, you need to check a lot more, because you may just be hitting that 80%. You're not seeing the other 20% that are not doing anything to secure container-to-container communications.
When Kubernetes it's not designed for managing or detecting these things. It's not designed for log analysis. It's meant to do what it's doing, which is work with containers and the workloads. It's not meant to even scan for misconfigurations.
Yeah. There's issues here that keep bubbling up the more research I do into the space. I think this one pretty much validates what we already kind of say ZT is the way to go about this, but a perimeter-based security model will not secure a containerized application. Good to see that most people said that that's accurate. I still am a little bit miffed on why people would say I disagree or I'm not really sure. How in my mind if someone can go, well, it's a dynamic system that doesn't really have an edge or a perimeter in itself anyway, so I can apply a perimeter-based model to that and think I've got it better. Just doesn't make a lick of sense to me.
Well, it's a yes or no question. They're answering maybe.
Yeah, right. It's 1 + 1 = 7. I think it's pretty cut and dry. If you're considering security strategy for something that is a dynamic space, cloud, ephemeral, that type of deal, I want to have my controls as close to ground truth as possible, and I want to be granular, which means ZT, not a perimeter.
Yeah, and I see the 80-20 here. 80 are going, perimeter-based isn't enough. I need to do something. The other 20%, I have a feeling in their mind, that's not my problem. The perimeter guys will secure this. I'm going to deploy for functionality, right? Let the security guys deal with at the perimeter. I'm just creating my containers to work. And that's a problem.
It sounds like there's about 20% that there's a problem child, right? 20% of problem children.
Yeah.
My experience, and this was good for me doing the survey because everybody always likes demographics, but I did have to put this in here as far as the experience level with containers, because again, I'm not an expert, but I wanted to get people that said that they're, pretty familiar with these. And the majority of folks that responded, almost 80-ish, 90-ish% of them, if you put it in totality, they were familiar with containers. They know what containers do. They were doing development with them. So the crux of the responses across the rest of this indicate to me that this is pretty close to honest answers you could get from folks that are actually doing the work. There's not a lot of pontification here. I mean, these are people that are either building and shipping code or managing and taking care of systems.
Yeah, it's a good spread.
Yes,
it's got a lot of agree and strongly agree. So
right. And Kubernetes, again, Kubernetes is super interesting, has the security controls that are necessary for containerized applications. And I threw a couple of I got you question or responses in here. Yes, Kubernetes is secure. No, Kubernetes has no out-of-the-box controls, or I'm unsure. Interestingly enough, and like I said, I had to do a bunch of research on this. Kubernetes, just like most things in cloud or AWS or whatever today, there's lots of options. There's lots of things that you can do, but sort of that are available based on just shipping it out of the box. It's not really that they're there. I'm not sure if either one of you've had much interaction with the Kubernetes controls.
I know that the question here, does it have security controls? Yeah, they exist, but mostly it's through third party or software as a service or add-ins of some nature. There's some things, the RBAC, the RBACs are pieces of it. There are other components to it. So they exist, but you may have to actually go out and find them, including things like, the data for the data security and the pool service meshes, things of that nature that, that you wouldn't necessarily know from the inherent part of just playing with the thing. You have to actually do your research and know what you're playing with.
Yeah, it's a lot of configuration, right? It's not secure out of the box when you turn it on. Things have to be configured, right? Because this is a development platform, there are lots of different options, right? It's not like in, Windows operating system where we're going to pre-configure some of these security things, because everybody's going to be using the operating system to run the, applications, right? These containers can do all sorts of different things. So they are a development platform by their very nature. They need to be very, very flexible. So yeah, the options are there, but you got to go in, you got to configure them. And that's going to determine how you use it and how you connect it and who you give access to and all those different things. What tools and third-party tools and your cloud provider tools that you're going to use. There's work involved. So it's not just install it and you're good to go. I'm sure they've got security baked in. Doesn't work that way.
No. Well, and that's something that I think we don't see enough, in organizations when they start figuring out the work that's required to build these things. They think, okay, we're going to build stuff, we're going to ship code, apps will work. But when you start asking them these questions about, well, what are you going to do about securing Kubernetes? How are you going to make sure that that's part of the progress and the plan and that there's not scope creep and all those other things? You usually get the kind of deer in the headlights look from people like, well, wait a minute, that's something we got to deal with. And if it's not part of the plan to begin with, it will not be part of the plan at the end of the process. Like that just doesn't happen.
It's very difficult to rebuild a teenager.
That's probably the best thing I've ever heard with the response to it's like, everybody says building a plane in flight, but I think rebuilding a teenager is even more applicable.
I like it. I'm so going to steal that.
Go ahead. I was a former teacher, so that's where I got it from.
Perfect. And these were demographics on who was there. So there's, a lot of folks that did respond said they were either a developer or a user of Kubernetes. And interestingly enough, I did have a couple or enough of respondents that were administrators and then executives. So, if you had a room of 67 people, this would be a pretty good breakdown of kind of the folks doing the work in the ditches all the way up to the people that are cutting the checks and planning, plotting, scheming. And it's good to have the demographics information, but it also, when you take that demographics and you kind of wrap it around the responses that we saw, you can see that there's a lot of skew and a lot of probable miscommunication between those work roles.
I actually like the fact that 50% are C-level or managers. I mean, because a lot of those, remember we were talking 80-20, 80 kind of understood it wasn't secure. I like it when C-level and managers have that in the back of their mind by default. Hey, it's probably not secure. That opens the wallet for time and for resources and everything, and they're going to be the ones asking the questions, right? So I think that's positive. I like that.
Yeah, it's good to get to the, I guess you'd call it the top of the food chain to get some of that leadership side of this as well. I hope that those leaders are asking the questions, from inception, and it's not becoming an after the fact type of conversation. But I guess this kind of leads me to a question I wanted to ask you guys off the cuff is, do you really think that secure development is a current practice, or is it something that is kind of really early and we're starting to understand that that's a need? Because I don't typically run into organizations that have a really well-defined secure development practice. Usually it's security and development, and hopefully there's some cross-pollination.
I see it as squishy. Mileage really varies, even within an organization, right? I've worked in very, very large organizations before, and some have just bulletproof. DevSecOps, all that kind of things whenever they're developing products and going to the cloud. And then an organization just down the aisle, I mean, they don't know how to say security. And it's all just functionality. And you look at their objectives, you look at their goals, you look at their product requirement documents. It doesn't say security or privacy or anything in it at all, right? So it's hit and miss, unfortunately. At least what I've seen.
Misses problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it really comes, a lot of it, the I want to call it the proper pressure would come from the people who buy those products, be it as an end user or a partner, to really ask the questions on the securing of those software packages and the codes. Because when it comes down to it, if they can't get the answers, you're going to eventually try to find someone as a customer who can, because the customers are the ones being asked the questions by their cyber insurance groups, et cetera, on these things. So they have to provide those answers, and just saying, well, we think it's good. When I look at this, the workflow, I do like that you had such a, that Chase had such a variety here, particularly from the C-levels and the managers. But I'm curious the correlation between that and those that answered the questions about unsure.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's a good point too. Have to figure out how to get some sort of demographic linking in the next survey I do there.
The takeaway for me is, everybody, if you are a C-level or a manager, this is your responsibility. You need to make sure it's in the objectives of the goal. You need to be asking the questions. You need to understand it does take time, effort, and potentially funding and everything else as part of projects. But this should be part of your role, right? You should be putting that in there. You are the one that check off the objectives and the design specs and everything else. Security needs to be in there. This is part of the responsibility. If it's led from the top, it will flow down to everybody else, especially in those developers. But if you're not asking it, it probably isn't getting done to the level that you would want. And the day that it surprises you, you're going to regret not asking it.
That's the day you're polishing your resume.
That's right. That's right.
It comes down to assumptions, which is, as I've researched more and more about Kubernetes, is the more you assume something, the more it's going to really bite you. And, Dr. Zero Trust, that's the whole thing. I think his mantra is don't assume, because you're going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Everybody has the responsibility on this list. Everybody.
Yeah, everybody. I think that's a critical point to make too. So this was my, I guess you'd call it my Perry Mason sort of thing, or a Columbo, right? One more question deal. Because earlier I asked, well, okay, if a perimeter would be a thing, would that be a way that you'd secure it? And some folks kind of said maybe-ish, maybe perimeter was the way. But here, I mean, if you look at the combine strongly and agree, right, everybody says essentially ZT makes sense. But the question that still comes back to me is, well, if everybody pretty much says that it's got to be ZT, why would anyone think that anything other than that is applicable in this context? And that I think is more of an organizational sort of cultural issue of maybe there's a way to kind of half and half do this. Like we can do a little bit of perimeter and some ZT, and maybe we'll link those things up together and it'll work. But we've got decades of proof that just isn't it. You either strategize and go in where you're going to make the most change and apply controls correctly, or you don't and you wind up in a bad place. That's pretty much how it looks to me. I've got
a cynical view here.
Oh, good.
So my cynical view is I love agree and strongly agree. Big surprise, right? I love that. But how much of that is just buzzwords, right? They hear ZT, they know everybody's talking about it. It's got to be the best thing, right? If we get ZT, it secures it. Of course we want ZT. Install that black ZT box and make everything secure. Just turn it on. Just turn that switch on. Right. And they really don't know what that means, but they're following the buzzwords like we do in the industry, right? And they think there is some magic black box that you install and it's all good and we're all secure, security's done, no more investment, and we go home, right? We get a good night's sleep. I'm concerned here.
Okay.
I don't think this is reflective of people understanding what ZT is and what it encompasses and the amount of work that it takes to institute and maintain, and the fact that there's still residual risk. I'm not buying it. I'm skeptical.
I think too, what occurs to me is I would like to take this sort of thing and apply it and go, I would buy a best of breed ZT solution based on an analyst report and see who responded to that one. Because if everyone gravitates to top right based on an MQ or wave, that's not really strategy. That's, like you said, that's leading the horse to water and then holding its head under.
That's wishful thinking. The easy solution,
right?
Whatever it is.
Lee, your thoughts?
Matt brings up a good point on the words, or what people are reacting to, perhaps more than really understanding what this really is. But I also think it goes back to a previous commentary on not taking responsibility or passing it on to a different siloed team versus it being the whole unit. Kubernetes is what it is it crosses over so many different disciplines that I think it'd be a major mistake for anyone to go, well, that should be the security officer's job. That team, they're the ones that are going to make this thing proper. When if a company decides to use the technologies, then they really need to understand it, and it has to be adopted as not only just talk about the strategy, but understanding what this whole thing is versus, oh, that's that team, that's this team, that's that team. I don't think that works.
Yeah, cross silo communication, breaking down the walls between people. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can we go back to the other slide?
Yeah.
For your next survey, what if you don't use the term zero trust and simply describe it? Right.
Then I think a piece of my soul dies or something.
MicroStrategy, access and control oversight, or something like that, right? But say it and see and compare the difference, because that delta is just following the industry buzzwords.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Just hacking the validity of Dr. Zero Trust survey.
Well, that's a good thing. You iterate, right? You get better. So this one, I was interested because I had not even thought about compliance as it applies to containerized workloads and cloud. And this was interesting because achieving compliance for containers is more difficult than for legacy applications. Immediately to me, even not being a container geek, is like, well, sure, because there's more of them and it's more spread and whatever else. But there still is a lot of folks that say no. Which is interesting. And I maybe I'm wrong because I'm not an auditor, but I think if you're failing compliance for one piece of that puzzle, you're failing compliance for all, especially in a containerized, burstable type of thing. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I think you've got a lot more risks, unseen risks, especially given kind of what we talked about and how containers get spun up, communicate, so on and so forth. I think you've got a lot more risks that you have to map out and understand those very short, potentially life cycles of those containers being built up and torn down. It makes it a mess for an auditor. So, I think the answer here is clearly yes, especially if you're an auditor. And the ones that are saying no, I would love to understand why you think it's no. Unsure, I get, but in my mind, this should be 80%, 90% yes is really what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. There should be a higher degree yes, and perhaps I think the ones in no would probably be under the unsure column because they don't really understand it.
Yeah.
Well, so that we crawled through a lot of material there. I appreciate you guys giving your insights. I think obviously I've got a few things to tweak on the next survey, which is great because this is the type of research that to me is super interesting. But any parting thoughts for me? It really, number one, I learned a lot about Kubernetes and containers and sort of workload application security that I didn't know before. But I think that the takeaway for me is exactly what you, Matt, and Lee were talking about, is that if you're using these types of things for applications that are aligned with your business, it's everybody's responsibility to be at least cognizant of what's going on there and then have a plan in place to deal with the risks so that you can continually work towards that. And I think that's a lazy person's way of saying strategy, but it is part of the overall equation, and it requires that investment from on high all the way down to the people that are literally writing the code.
Yeah, and especially if you're in that product team, right? You're either executives or you're a manager in that space. It's up to you. You have a crucial responsibility to make sure security is in the forefront. There's people responsible for it. It's part of the objectives. It's being tested. It's you. And if you don't step up, I guarantee you it's not going to be secure. You are abdicating to failure when it comes to security unless you step forward. So it's up to you. Don't be shy. Dive into it.
Yeah, but I agree, and that to me it comes down to don't assume anything. If you double check everything, even Kubernetes, as I was reading about it further, they have emission controllers as part of it, which is not necessarily on by default, but that's part of the exist to do double checking on the RBACs. So while if the system is designed in ways that requires some things to do double checking, I think the people who are using this technology should double check their knowledge base.
Well, there you have it. CalicoCon, thanks for having us. Two of the best in the business, Matthew Rosenquist and Lee Seidman. If you're looking for stuff on cyber, there's not two better people you could reach out to. So they're easy to find on LinkedIn, I can tell you that much. I'm Chase Cunningham. I'm easy to find in a variety of places because I never shut up, and I'm always looking to talk to people about this stuff. So thank you guys for participating and for your insights.
Thank you much.
Thank you, guys.
Cloud-native applications can't be secured with the traditional security tools. You need a more active and granular level of security. Calico Cloud is an active cloud-native application protection platform that detects, prevents, and mitigates breaches in cloud-native applications. Let's look at how to secure your cloud-native environment at build time with Calico's container security. At build time, we want to make sure that images that the development team provides are clean and without major vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. All image registries are auto-populated and continuously scanned by Calico's scanning engine. I can also manually add new registries. It's very easy for me to see the results of the last scan from the scan results page. Pass-fail is color-coded with specific scores. Details about each vulnerability that impacts each image are available on the right side. I can control which images can be displayed to my environment using admission control policies. I am only allowing images with pass or worn scan results. I've also enforced an upper limit for the age of a scan result. Now, if any application developer attempts to deploy an image that doesn't pass the security criteria, it will automatically be blocked. Once you have the admission policies in place, you may come across a situation where the application developer is telling you that a particular vulnerability does not impact their code and the way in which they are using the affected library. In this case, you need to create an exception. Calico Cloud offers a number of options to scope the exception to a specific image version, any version of this image, or any image. In addition to scanning and assessment of images, I must ensure the Kubernetes environment is also secure and does not have any misconfigurations. Calico helps you continuously assess your Kubernetes